Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the study. Now, in the previous lecture, we've discussed extensively about the functionality of moral education. Now, as we said before, we must treat moral education as the first and foremost task of governance. So, in today's lecture, we'll discuss another aspect of governance, and it is the concept of vigilance. Now, vigilance is more about having the right mindset, right? As you can probably imagine, a ruling body or a leader must be able to anticipate danger before it happens. And this, it doesn't require any superpower, but it is simply a vigilant mindset, a vigilant mentality. For example, the CEO of a public company must always watch out for competition and new entrants into the market, right? Small, innovative companies may be able to quickly eat away the market share of large, established companies if the company doesn't take precautionary action to strengthen the competitiveness. And the management team should also be aware of the change in workers' work ethics and the working atmosphere. Likewise, when managing a country, if the government takes its prosperity as given and makes no effort to understand potential social problems and doesn't take social unrest seriously, then one can imagine or expect the country to lose prosperity and peace at some point in the future. So we'll divide our discussion on vigilance in three ways. We'll first look at the cultural background, and then we'll discuss why vigilance is important, especially in the good times. And lastly, we'll examine the practice of vigilance from the perspective of the government ministers of ancient China. Okay, so chapter 1, cultural background. Now during most of the time, of ancient Chinese history, the government or the ruling body has maintained a mentality of vigilance. Now we say most of the time because there were indeed some rulers who were totally disregarded vigilance, and therefore the country was in turmoil. So historians and kings always use these failed rulers as warnings or case studies to remind themselves about the importance of vigilance. Vigilance is also the general sense of mission of all Chinese literati, even today. There is a very popular expression which says, everyone is responsible for the rise and fall of the world. Everyone. In fact, this has been a very common perception among the Chinese, not just the literati, but even those social segments that are not always under the limelight. But literati is the particular group of people who take the sense of mission as part of their job. Okay? Now, we all understand what it means, but let me explain the significance of this a bit further. First of all, this sense of mission comes from the deep influence of the ethical education on the mindset of the Chinese civilization. Now, as you may remember from the previous lecture where we talked about the process of education, ethical education starts with personal cultivation, right? So people learn about filial piety and the theory of benevolence and righteousness, and they improve their own behavior based on the realization of what is right and what is wrong. But ultimately, the purpose of ethical education is to improve the 5 human relations and social harmony. And this is done through influencing the people around us. So when society in general practices benevolence, righteousness, and propriety, then social harmony is realized. Therefore, the starting point is not, other people, but it is oneself. It starts from personal cultivation, not somebody else's cultivation. So this is why we said that, everyone is responsible for the rise and fall of the world. And it's not simply a word of encouragement, but a description of the truth. So this is the first significance. The second significance is the sense of worries. Okay, we don't normally hear this word worries when it comes to a governance, either social governance or corporate governance. We treat governing as a mechanical process in the sense that, as long as there is proper education and regulation in place, everything should be in order, right? However, the very origin or motivation of revitalizing ethical education and regulation is a sense of concern that something may go wrong. You see, human society is dynamic, and a small mistake in governing can turn into a big social unrest in the future. So, for a person to be qualified for government official position, before considering the hard requirement on certificate or work experience, a sense of worries is actually very important. A sense of worries is like a fire detector, or a warning sign, and is much more cost-effective to deal with a problem before it materializes than after. So, vigilance is incredibly desirable feature of the ruling body. If we look at the ancient Chinese history, the good times and prosperous periods have always been accompanied by vigilant kings and vigilant emperors. And the careless kings are always followed by their own demise. For example, during the early Han Dynasty, the country was suffering from years of civil war, and the economic development came to a halt. So, in order to revive the country, around 180 BC, Emperor Wen initiated a stimulus plan based on cutting tax on agricultural land. In year 13, the government even reduced the land tax down to zero. This is significant because the government, would have to tighten its own income source and let the farmers retain almost all of their revenue. Meanwhile, the country was very cautious in carrying out its military activities to fend off assault from some neighboring forces. Wars would consume national resources, right, and damage economic recovery. Instead of engaging in military confrontation, the government made peace with the neighboring forces through diplomatic channels. Now, Emperor Wen's successor, Emperor Jing, continued to work with the people through light fiscal policy and building infrastructures. Meanwhile, he amended the law and promoted cautious approach in using punishment. Emperor Jing also continued to make peace with the neighboring states and opened international trade. Now, what is most significant about the period of Wen and Jing is that both emperors promoted the ethics-led governing approach and influenced the people through ethical education. Emperor Taizong of Tang Dynasty is another example of vigilant governance. Now, although he helped his father to overthrow the Sui dynasty and won the country, he was very concerned about his lacking of governing experience and thereby repeating the mistakes made by the previous kings. So this really motivated him to order the compilation of the governing principles of ancient China in the first place. Now, what is very interesting and meaningful to know is that Emperor Taizong assigned a certain virtuous minister to follow him every day to record his mistakes. He would then review these records and correct his mistakes. So this kind of vigilant mindset is an absolutely precious lesson for all of us to learn and apply in modern governance. I mean, we all know the wonderful economic and social achievement led by Emperor Taizong, right? Now, in contrast to the vigilant kings, of course, those who disregarded the previous good practice inevitably led to governance failure. The Western Han dynasty ended around 8 AD, and the government around that period was becoming increasingly corrupted, and wealth was highly concentrated. Although many ministers had given suggestion to tackle the inequality issue, because a significant portion of the government was connected with powerful, wealthy families, they were unwilling to comply with such policies, which would inevitably harm their interest. So the Western Han dynasty was eventually overthrown. The later part of Tang dynasty also experienced similar fate. Okay, now if you think about the evolution of a country from its heydays of both economic supremacy and ethical advancement to complete chaos, we must ask the question, what happened? Right? What happened? Well, Mencius has given us the answer. He said, life springs from sorrow and calamity, and death from ease and pleasure. So this means that a state of sorrow and calamity doesn't necessarily lead to failure, but in contrast, it motivates people to take every precaution and be vigilant, and therefore the society can be revived and thrive. On the other hand, too much pleasure can cause a dilution of safety, and from the moment the ruling bodies stop being vigilant, problems start to take root. So, and also, if problems are not solved in time, death and demise are the only certainty. Now, vigilance has always been an important part of Confucius' teaching of governance, and he gave a very good example of what vigilance actually looks like. Okay, so when he visited the temple of Duke Huan of Lu, he saw a tilting vessel. Okay, as you can see, a tilting vessel. Now, this vessel used to be placed by the right-hand side of the king in the palace, so it's also called the right-hand vessel. So what's so special about this vessel then? Well, when it's empty, it faces downwards. But as you pour liquid into it, or water, the center of gravity starts to shift towards the middle of the vessel. Now, as the weight of the liquid reaches a certain level, the vessel reaches an equilibrium and is stabilized facing upwards. However, if we continue to add water into the vessel, then it will lose balance and will tilt over. And when the vessel is eventually tilted, it doesn't happen gradually, but quickly. Okay, so it's impossible to reverse the situation. This is to remind the ruling body. When implementing government policies, the government needs to constantly monitor the response and the result, and keep in mind whether or not the moral compass has been compromised. Because we know that morality is what enables a society to maintain prosperity, not simply economic development alone. So, after knowing the importance of vigilance, I suppose the elephant in the room is, what does vigilance entail? What is it? It has to be more sophisticated than a simple statement of be careful, right? Now, the governing principles of ancient China have provided the following general guidelines of vigilance. And it says that when a person is smart and knowledgeable, make sure to protect with silliness. When a person has made great contribution or achievement, make sure to protect the achievement with courtesy. When a person is brave and invincible, protect it with prudence. And when a person is wealthy and resourceful, protect the wealth with humbleness. So these conditions make sure a number of things. For example, the smartness is not misused and damage people's life. Achievement does not lead to jealousy and opposition. Braveness doesn't lead to unnecessary warfare. And wealth doesn't induce a sense of pride and decadence. So these principles can be applied on personal level, family level, company level, and of course, country level. Now, vigilance is in fact very scientific because it considers the objective of human habit, which is desire and craving for pleasure and ease. It is very easy, right, for people to be absorbed by desire. But the cultivation of morality is more subtle. So craving for pleasure and satisfying desire is like walking down the hill. It doesn't need a lot of effort. But cultivation is like walking up the hill, and it needs a lot of motivation and it's hard work. So this is why when Emperor Yu accepted the throne from Emperor Shun, he was reminded by Shun that only through diligent cultivation and single-mindedness can one attain the middle path. Confucius further pointed out that vigilance is constantly needed because, as he said, if a man takes no thought about what is distant, he will find sorrow near at hand. So this means that if we don't prepare for potential crisis, even if we are perfectly safe at the moment, one day the crisis will happen, and when it does happen, we'll have nothing to deal with it. And by then we'll all be the frogs in hot water. Okay, now, having understood the cultural background of the concept of vigilance in ancient Chinese governance, we now turn to the detailed explanation of vigilant governance. When we talk about vigilant governance, we often refer to being vigilant during the good times. This is because vigilance is needed more during the good time. And there are three reasons why vigilance is needed in the good time. Okay, so let's have a look at them one by one. Now, the first reason is maintaining prosperity is actually more difficult than creating prosperity in the first place. Now, if we compare the Sui dynasty, which ended in 619 AD, with the following Tang dynasty, we can see a sharp contrast in their economic condition and military power between the two. The Sui dynasty was, very strong and wealthy. It was more powerful than Tang dynasty in every way. For example, it had more resources, stronger and more sophisticated military, a larger population and human power. But the society of the late Sui dynasty was in chaos and distress. In particular, the government policy constantly disrupted people's economic production. Emperor Yang of the Sui dynasty indulged in a luxurious lifestyle. He ordered the construction of many public projects that put great pressure on the people. He also initiated many military expeditions that cost heavily in terms of both resources and human power. And above all, Emperor Yang was known as executing his own relatives and loyal ministers. So this led to the social unrest and the sentiments of revolt. We must say, Emperor Yang was in fact a very capable and intelligent person. And he had done many great work, actually. But his overconfidence, uncontrolled use of the people, and his lacking of vigilance and moral conduct made sure that none of the prior economic achievement was strong enough to save his government. In contrast, after Tang dynasty was established, right after the war against the Sui dynasty, the society was very stable. Although the economic condition was poor, apparently, after the war, people were left undisturbed to manage their own economic activity. the government policy emphasized on cost control, and the ruling body lived a frugal life, and above all, the emperor himself led a government-wide revitalization of traditional governing principles. Everybody in the government followed the emperor's leadership to study ethics and self-cultivate. And very importantly, they constantly reminded themselves of the reason that led to the failure of the previous dynasty and made sure that they don't do it again. In fact, there are many history literatures that recorded the meetings between Emperor Taizong and his ministers, where they discussed the ups and downs of previous leaders, previous dynasties, and encouraged the ministers to remain vigilant, even when the country was on its way to become one of the greatest and most glory nations of human history. But apart from Sui dynasty, another example of a short-lived success of powerful leader is the failure of Qin dynasty. Okay, the failure of Qin dynasty in the later part of the 3rd century BC. The state of Qin was the most powerful state during the Warring State period. And after a long period of division and wars, the state of Qin won all the wars against all the states and united the land of China. But unfortunately, the first emperor was ruthless and very harsh on the people. His successor, his son, it was even worse. Not only did he live a luxurious life, but he slaughtered loyal ministers but trusted treacherous, two-faced officials. As a result, the Qin dynasty only lasted for 2 generations, no more than 15 years. So I think up to this point, I would like to encourage our viewers and learners to take the governing principles of ancient China with great seriousness. I mean, history is like a mirror, right? And they're not only theories of governance, but also case studies, experiences, empirical evidence on what works and what doesn't work. They are the most valuable cream of 5,000 years of ups and downs and success and failure. And most importantly, the lessons of governance are not unique to China. They're valuable to all the countries in the world. And they're now offered to everyone, and every government official can take away a few things, I suppose, which will prove beneficial to their people. Now, the second reason why the government needs to be vigilant during the good time is that the government should simply want to extend the prosperity for as long as possible. Now, although this is sort of stating the obvious, of course, yes, we want to extend it forever, but not everybody really understands how. In fact, many governments only focus on temporary and short-term economic boom. This may be driven by political pressure, which is understandable, or simply because of misunderstanding of the governing principles. You see, we all want economic boom, but if prosperity is short-lived, then it is not really prosperity. Prosperity is also all-inclusive, right? Both material and mental. Therefore, true prosperity is a stable improvement of both material and mental well-being of all the members of the society. Now, there are many aspects that constitute a mentally rich society, such as good education, and we all know what that means by now. The weak are being protected and not appropriated by the strong. The elderly should have a fulfilling life and not to feel that they are abandoned by the society, etc. But let's talk about the overarching channel, through which lasting prosperity is realized. Now, in achieving a prolonged prosperity, which is more important, the law and regulation or the human development? In other words, is it the institution that is more important, or the person who operates that institution more important? Well, from Lecture 2, we know that a good system must be designed and implemented by people with virtues. And if lawmakers are not virtuous, then either the system will be wrongly designed or it is misused to suit certain interest groups. So we can safely conclude that human development is more important than law. In fact, when we're pursuing the stability and the harmony of society and the country, essentially we're pursuing the stability and harmony of the people, aren't we? I mean, the people is the final destination, and the society is an abstract vehicle. So the aim of vigilance is the people, is human. In other words, society, nation, law, and system, these are different forms of vigilance. They are abstract. But the essence of vigilance is human. They are more concrete and purposeful. Now, because human beings are purposeful, and because it is the leaders and ministers who operate the institutions, prolonged prosperity means that the object of vigilance is about the development of the future leaders and the ministers. Now, we can certainly improve law and constitutions, right? No doubt, which are the right thing to do. But the operators are of higher importance. Therefore, we can now turn our vigilant discussion into some very concrete questions about the operators, right? For example, for the ruler, we're concerned whether or not he or she is possessed by extravagant mindset. What is going to happen to his management, right? What if the leader has an inappropriate sense of pride? What is going to happen to his relationship with the rest of the government or with foreign leaders? These questions are concerned about the leader, but also concerns about the people eventually, because the leader's action has a direct impact on the institution, the law, the economy, the social ethics, and of course, the people. Likewise, for the ministers. For the ministers, we may be concerned about whether or not they are afraid to give candid advice to the ruler. In one of the future lectures, we'll see that ministers who worry about their own job, giving no good advice, are not loyal ministers. And this will have a great effect on the long-term prosperity of the people. Now, the third reason of vigilance is that a government can always be overturned by the people. I suppose, if there is only one reason for the government to be vigilant, it is the concern of its own safety, isn't it? For example, why would you walk cautiously on a busy street? Because you want to avoid danger. Why would you manage your company carefully? Because you want to avoid bankruptcy, right? Likewise, when managing a country, there is also a chance that the ruling body is overturned. Therefore, the governing principle suggests that the action of the people is the ultimate source of vigilance and worries. In Chinese, there's a saying that goes, people are like water. People are like water. They can support the boat and also overturn it. I think this is quite an accurate description of the relationship between the people and the government in most political systems, right? So we divide this section into two parts. First of all, we'll examine the so-called leader-people mutuality. And second, we'll discuss the details of the government's concern about the people. Okay, now, first of all, mutuality. This is in fact very simple physics. The people need a lead, much the same way that an army needs a commander, a company needs a chief executive, a kitchen of a busy restaurant needs a head chef, right? People also need a leader. Now, without a leader, the society cannot stabilize. You might argue that, perhaps people can manage themselves. However, we do observe, even in a very small community like a team, with 4 or 5 members, there is still a demand for someone to set the direction or at least to make a final decision. Now, this decision can be the result of a discussion or the opinions of an authority, such as someone with more experience or qualification and whatnot. But the point is, without a leader, it would have been very difficult to organize complex human activities. So people need a leader. That's one thing. On the other hand, from the leader's perspective, the leader will not survive or his political life will not last without the support of those he governs, which is the people. Even if a person becomes a leader, right, without strong and genuine support from the people, he or she will be overturned eventually. And this can take many forms. And of course, the most violent form is a revolution. The governing principles recorded many historic events about this kind of incidents, and they give enormous emphasis on the danger of disregarding the people and losing support. So ultimately, only those who are truly loved by the people will be granted the power to govern. And the power we're talking about here is a permission to govern. The permission is not the same as a legal permission. It includes legal permission, but also includes mental support and admiration from the people. This is what we mean by mutuality. Now, a deeper meaning of the people supporting the leader concept is brought out by the governing principle as follows. It says, if you were not conceited, no one in the world would strive to surpass your position. If you were not boastful, no one in the world would strive to surpass your contributions. Now, this is in fact the advice given by Emperor Shun to his successor Yu, before Yu ascended to the throne. So why is this comment useful? Well, it is natural for a leader or either company or political leader to worry about their authority and position. It's natural, right? But it's also natural for a leader to try to showcase their contribution to the people. For example, I've done this for you, I've done that for you, that sort of thing. And the purpose of this sort of gesture is to make sure that his or her position continues to be supported. And this is all a very natural thing to do and understandable. However, a true leader doesn't really have to worry about that. Why? Well, if a leader is doing really well, it is not in the best interest of the people to deny the leader's contribution or position. I mean, what is it in the people to deny in the first place, right? There isn't much rationale here. But the people may deny the leader's position and power if the leader becomes arrogant and overly proud. When the leader becomes arrogant, then the position or the contribution he claims is very likely to be overstated. And if that's the case, the people will find it uncomfortable to accept. And that is where the problem is. Meanwhile, when the leader becomes arrogant and overly proud, he is likely to make suboptimal decisions, which will inevitably hurt the people's interest. So under these circumstances, the position of a leader will become a little shaky, if you like. Otherwise, there is no reason, right, for the people to revolt. But of course, sometimes people may not be rational in the short term, so this is a more complicated issue. But I guess the recommendation for the government is that the ultimate thing to worry about is to maximize the interest of the people. And it has to be real interest, not just for showcasing. The second thing that we would like to talk about is the details of the leader's concerns about the people. Okay, the leader's concerns about the people, in the sense that what should the leader be worrying about? And worry is a necessary mentality, but it has to be concrete when it comes to daily job. If you look at the governing principles, the first concern could be the insufficiency in material economic life. In Volume 2, the governing principle says when he gives repose to the people, his kindness is felt, and the people cherish him in their hearts. This is very obvious, but yet important causality. Okay, the first thing a leader should be doing is to make sure that the people can maintain their economic well-being. If this is nicely achieved, people can bring home sufficient nourishment for the family, take care of their parents, raise the kids, make the wife happy, or the other way around rather, then people would have a reason to be content and consequently be thankful to the leader who made this happen. But material satisfaction is just the first step of good governance. A person who focuses only on material satisfaction may end up never to be content in the end, because human desire is practically endless. The same goes to a country. If government policies only promote material enrichment, then the people may end up in a vicious cycle of competition against each other. So, in an advanced society, governance not only achieves material enrichment, but realizes a harmonious interpersonal relationship among the members of the society. In other words, the 5 human relations must be in good order. But does this mean that the economic enrichment and mental enrichment are 2 separate things? No. They're in fact closely related to each other. And more specifically, from the perspective of human development, the ancient Chinese understood that the purpose of economic enrichment is to set the foundation for mental or spiritual achievement or advancement. And this is because for the common people, only when they are materially satisfied to some degree will they have the capacity to consider human relations or the practice of virtues and self-cultivation, right? And surely there are always, some sages people who self-cultivate regardless of their material position. But for the general public, it is simply inappropriate to ask for this, if not cruel. So only after material satisfaction is achieved can the common people come round and think about propriety, social behavior, and righteousness, etc. Now, although the history shows us that economic production is important, there is also a concern about the unintended negative consequence on people's mental development. Okay, unintended consequence on mental development. And there is a very delicate analysis given by Guan Zi. Okay, Guan Zi was the chancellor and a great politician of the state of Qi during the spring and autumn period. He used an example of the production of boat to demonstrate the idea. Okay, the production of boat. So he said, look, in the past, when the sages kings produced boat, it was for the only purpose of transportation and commercial use. Right? So the production specification was simple and practical. But later on, when luxurious lifestyle started to take root, people started to add all kinds of things onto the boat, such as decorations and carving. Decorations and carvings had very little practical utility, but represented certain social status, right? They satisfy vanity. They don't satisfy transportation. So this led to 3 potential problems. The first problem is that those who could afford expensively decorated boat would compete for the boat. Because mostly it was the ministers, right? The ministers who could finance an expensive boat. there will likely be competition among them. So that's the first problem. The second problem is that there would be a demand for embroidery work, which is normally taken up by female. But female in the past mainly engage in textile production. So a rising demand for embroidery would crowd out the workforce in the textile industry. And this will lead to inefficiency in the provision of basic economic goods. Textile is about clothing, and clothing is more fundamental than embroidery. So what is the point of having many nicely decorated boats when there is not enough clothes? Now, of course, this may not seem to be a problem in today's technologically advanced society, but we can easily think of something very similar, such as the provision of basic housing for the poor people versus huge government spending on nuclear warhead. Right? Now, the third problem is that male workers would be abandoning their original agricultural production and be absorbed into the work of carving decorations of the boat. This could produce even more severe problems than textile industry, which is insufficiency in food provision. So all three, the competitive mentality among ministers, the inefficiency in basic economic provision, will lead to one thing, which is rising criminal activity. On the one hand, you have the rich classes who compete for luxurious lifestyle, nice boats, and on the other hand, you have insufficient supply of crucial product. And in this scenario, crime is bound to happen, bound to take place. Of course, this is just a simple model put forth by Guan Zi, but we can definitely see the point here, right? So the concern about economic life is twofold. One is that there is not enough to support the people, which will impair mental advancement, and two is that the direction of economic development is misguided and lead to unhealthy practice. And this will lead to impairment of mental advancement as well. So that was the first concern. Now, the second concern about the people is the lacking of ethical education. We have emphasized a number of times so far in our course that the point of vigilance regarding education is not just normal education, but it is more about ethical education. And ethical education is the fundamental. It's fundamental to achieving harmony in human relations. We also know that the fate of the country and the quality of governance has a very high correlation with the quality of the leader, right? Although, certain societies pay more attention to their leaders than the others, but in general, people tend to follow their leaders' guidance and demonstration very naturally. The book of history says that heaven gives birth to the people with such desires that without a ruler they must fall into all disorders. So the point of vigilance of education is also about the education of the leader. If a good leader could demonstrate certain ethical superiority, then people were likely to imitate. This is not by force, by the way, right? But natural thing to do. In fact, when we look at celebrities and famous people, we also tend to imitate some of their characters, don't we? So a leader of a country, is in a unique position. He or she is someone many people look up to. So a leader's behavior can impact social atmosphere with great efficiency. So this is why, in order to lead the people, we say that the leader must be morally superior first. In fact, education itself can also be defined as the process where people in the lower position copy people in the higher position. Okay. Now, this can be interpreted in many related ways. In science education, for example, we learn from those who know more about science than us. Right? So for us, they're in a high position in terms of knowledge and experience. But in ethical education, we learn from ethically superior people. Now, in terms of imitation, this happens very naturally from people in the lower position to those above them. Now, even if high position people do not intentionally teach anything, they are in fact teaching through demonstration. So there is natural education. In ancient Chinese history, Emperor Yao was regarded as one of the sagest kings, mainly because he educated the people very successfully based on his own virtue. The governing principles document that Emperor Yao has such a benevolent heart, and he felt the pain for the crimes and punishment suffered by his subjects. And so when he saw punishment, he didn't think that, you got what you deserved. No, he felt that this was because of him, as in he didn't give a good enough moral guidance. Emperor Yao's virtue was very far-reaching, and people in the neighboring states were influenced immensely and gradually changed their behavior. Of course, something like this doesn't happen overnight. It takes time for the influence to take root and for the society to modify itself. But it doesn't undermine the importance of vigilance, right? If the leader makes a bad example and the people are negatively influenced, it will take even longer time for the society to change. Finally, what does this have to do with the notion that the people may overturn the government? Well, clearly, when the social atmosphere has deteriorated to a certain level, people will no longer be able to control their anger, and the stability of the society and indeed the government will be at risk. So whether or not being supported or overturned by the people has everything to do with the leader's own ethical education. Now, in the final chapter of this lecture, we will switch gear and have a look at the concerns of the ministers or government officials. Now, as compared to the leader in the previous chapter, the ministers or government officials have a slightly different set of concerns and focus of vigilance. So we'll classify the concern of ministers into two categories. Firstly, the concern about the leader's benevolence, and secondly, the concern about the bad implementation of policies. Okay? Now, by the way, for some of these concerns, I believe they're not unique to the Chinese, but are shared by many virtuous and excellent government officials all around the world. Okay? So, firstly, the ministers are concerned about the leader's benevolence and virtue. Now, this may seem a little repetitive because we have already discussed the importance of the leader's own ethical quality on governance, right? But we should like to mention this again because this is from, the minister's perspective or the government officials in general. This is what's going through their head when they evaluate the leaders. The governing principle emphasized that the country's fate really depends on the internal factors of the government, not so much on the external factors, such as natural resources or geographic location, etc. If the leader is virtuous, he or she will bring stability to the nation, otherwise there will be chaos. Now, the reason that the ministers are concerned about the leader's virtue is twofold. On a shallow level, their jobs are on the line, right? If the government is overturned, there goes their pensions, their jobs. But on the deeper level, a virtuous leader can support the ministers to realize their ambitions and to achieve the greatness. So for a righteous minister, right, who put the interest of the country before their own, they would welcome a virtuous leader, because the leader will take the country to the right direction. The leader's achievement is also the achievement of the ministers as well, right? And that's why the ministers are concerned about the leader's quality. So let's have a look at two specific qualities, right? Two specific qualities that the leaders pay attention to. The first one is whether or not the leader favors fame over virtue, right? Fame over virtue. So what's the problem? Doesn't everybody love to be famous? What's the harm? Well, the governing principles record a paragraph from the book called 中论. It says, nothing can do more harm to a leader than widespread knowledge of the fact that he craves adoration and popularity. Once a leader falls into the traps of wanting an inflated name for himself, his officials will know what he wants and conform to his wishes. So according to this argument here, loving fame has negative consequence. Because it is natural for the subordinates to want to please the leader, right? And sometimes, not in an explicit way or even a bad way, but it is natural for subordinates to act in a way that pleases the leader because of the concern of his own job and benefit. Well, if the leader practices virtue, then this is even better because the subordinates would want to raise their own ethical standard to a level similar to the leader. But if the leader loves fame or fake honor, then it attracts all kinds of fake compliments. So a righteous minister will find this problematic because the leader may fall into the trap of treacherous subordinates and may be misled or misguided. Consequently, the vision of the leader would be blocked, and this is essentially a nightmare of governance. Now, here we have an example. Where the leader's preference results in imitation. Okay, here it is. So the Duke Ling of the state of Chu, which is around 535 BC. Okay, so Duke Ling of the state of Chu liked slender waists. Okay, this is probably a perception of fashion of the time. Okay, there's nothing weird about that, I guess. So what happened was all of his ministers and close officers started to limit themselves to a single meal a day so that they can tie their belts. And the result was that they were quite exhausted, apparently, and couldn't even stand straight. Now you might think, wow, this is a bit of an extreme, isn't it? I mean, it's never going to happen now. Well, yes, probably, almost nobody would pay attention to the leader's waist preference anymore these days, but they do pay attention to something else, such as foreign policy preference, attitude, and the way of handling certain domestic issues. So I would say such imitation is not going away. It is part of the nature at the place of work. The subordinates may simply want to stand out from the crowd, and this could motivate him or her to take the leader's liking and disliking to an extreme. Therefore, it is very important for the leader to be extremely cautious when showing his preference. Right? And because there will be ripple effect, and I should add amplified ripple effect in the society. Okay? Now, similar to the previous quality, okay, a righteous minister would be also, quite concerned when the leader prefers profit to benevolence, right? Prefer profit to benevolence. Now, you may recall the conversation between King Hui of Liang and Mencius. The theoretical conclusion from the conversation is that having a leader who prefers profit-making over benevolence is likely to result in a social level change of atmosphere. And this change in atmosphere is about the generally accepted value of life. The generally accepted value of life. That will change. In the Chinese language, there is a phrase called 安居乐业. Right, there's a phrase of that. In traditional governance, this phrase is constantly referred to when people talk about the aim of the governance. Okay, so the four characters, as you can see, they represent four aspects of life. And they are peace and stability, which is the first character, and then living, being content with, and lastly, occupation. So altogether, this phrase means that people are able to live in peaceful and stable way while enjoying what they do for a living. Of course, this target is a bit like a mathematical approximation or the concept of full employment in macroeconomics. Okay, we're always sort of getting close to the target, but at any point in time, we always find ourselves below target. So we never get there 100%, but we're always getting close to it. Okay, because there are always people and families who are not living a peaceful life and not enjoying their jobs. But the point is, this is what we are all aiming for. Now, the important point about this definition, about this aim or target, is that financial success is not mentioned, right? We don't see money in this phrase. This is not because profit-making or wealth is not important. It is very important. But money is still a few steps away from peace, a few steps away from stability or being content. Now, as we mentioned before, money is not the final destination, but a channel. And more precisely, one of the channels of happiness. In the ancient Chinese history record, the interaction between social stability and money-making can be found in many literatures. When you examine a period of failed governance, oftentimes we see a king who is only driven by money and fame. And when we examine a period of economic prosperity, we find that the kings do not emphasize on money alone, but more about the social stability and ethical governance. So this kind of cycles and interactions really warrant our attention and study. For example, under the leadership of Emperor Guan of the Han Dynasty, the country's economy was revived from the devastation of previous wars. Okay, as we probably said before. Agriculture, irrigation infrastructure, commerce, handicraft manufacturing became well developed. But Emperor Guan concluded that the secret to manage a country is to have a virtuous leader who understands how to harness the people's mind of ethics using benevolence and love. And the leader must also avoid creating a profit-driven society. So when evaluating the success of governance, it is better to use peace, stability, contentment as a benchmark, rather than solely relying on production per capita or things like that. So in the previous section, we talked about the concern of the ministers over the leader's personal quality. Now we'll have a look at the another area of concern of the ministers, which is the problem in policy implementation. Well, obviously, there are numerous government policies, right? And they come in various shapes and size and forms, and targeting different areas of the people's life and country governance. So we're not going to discuss any particular policy, but rather we'll examine the consequence of government policies from a higher level. In volume 35 of the governing principle, there is a discussion about the effective outcome of policies. For example, imagine there is a policy A, okay? Policy A. This policy A only emphasizes on the expansion of territory and securing authority. Okay? And meanwhile, this policy A tends to ignore the benevolent side of governance and the promotion of ethics. So if you put these two together, we say that this policy prefers expansion of territory and ignores the expansion of benevolence, right? Let me say that again. This policy A, we say it prefers expansion of territory and ignores the expansion of benevolence. It prefers securing authority but ignoring the promotion of ethics. So that's the idea, okay? Now, the term of territory can be all-inclusive, not just physical land, but also the market, the economy, and etc. So it's not necessarily a problem for a country to expand its economy, but we have to look at what the country doesn't expand at the same time, right? Now, in terms of the final effect of the policy, okay, the government principle said that the policy A is said to be the same as policy B, a different policy. But policy B prefers a certain fate of destruction and ignores the condition of long-term prosperity. Okay, let me repeat. Policy B prefers a certain fate of destruction and ignores the condition of long-term prosperity. So what does that mean then? Well, clearly, no government, would design a set of policy that says on the front page, this policy aims to destroy the country and abandons long-term prosperity. But policy A has the same effect and the same effective outcome as our imaginary policy B. Okay? So this is where, vigilance is required. Government policies must be extremely thoughtful and circumspect. Sometimes, because of public sentiment or lacking of experience, some policies may seem exciting and correct, but they are one-sided and can lead to problems in the long term. And when the situation becomes serious, it leads to destruction that costs future generations. Now, we just want to illustrate this point by examining one particular aspect of government policy, which is human resource management. Now, the governing principle have a lot of materials on human resource management, and we'll have 4 dedicated lectures on this particular topic. Previously, we have established that the leader must be careful with the ethical quality of those around him. Right? The leader is, after all, a human being, and human beings are not perfect, and we're not always rational. Treacherous officials may take advantage of those irrationalities and influence the leader in a bad way. So a leader under the influence of treacherous officials may deviate from the righteous path, and his objectives may be in conflict with those of the righteous ministers or officials. So for this reason, righteous ministers who treat the fate of the country as their own are often very vigilant about the human resource management of the top leader. In the Analects, Confucius said that leaders should avoid employing a minister who solely focuses on personal profit or benefit. Why? Well, Confucius pointed out that a minister with a profit-driven mentality would be fearless. He would do he would do anything. For example, before he gets a promotion or remuneration, he will worry about not getting it. Once he gets it, he worries about losing it. This is all he ever thinks about. So if this is the case, as he worries about losing it, there is nothing which he will not do. Also, the higher the position, the more serious the problem becomes. Now, the governing principles raise this as an issue simply because it is not easy to employ virtuous officials. It's not easy. Not impossible, but not easy. This is well explained in the volume 46 of the governing principles. So let's have a look. Right, so let's first assume that the government wants to recruit virtuous people. Okay, now I think this is a reasonable assumption, right? For a government that wants to do something good for the people, they would want to recruit virtuous officials, and it would be very difficult to comprehend why not, right? And second, let's assume that there are some virtuous candidates who apply for the position. If there is no virtuous people applying for the job, then, I guess our discussion would end very quickly. But having virtuous candidates doesn't mean they will be employed. When a virtuous person presents, two things may happen. Okay, one is that the leader simply cannot recognize his ability. And there are various reasons for this. Perhaps the able person is not very good at advertising himself. There are some stories in the governing principles that warn the leader, do not judge a person's ability based on what they say. I think I've mentioned this before. Unfortunately, it's very easy to judge somebody based on his or her speech, because it's straightforward. And we're emotional beings, so that we tend to make too quick of a decision based on what we hear and what we see. So in this case, the leader may miss out able ministers. However, even after the ability of the candidate is recognized, he may still not be recruited. And this may be caused by the objections from the opposing members of the government, as well as financial and, of course, headcount issues. But for whatever reason, able people who have great ambitions to serve the country may simply be missed out. And this will inevitably lead to what we call a suboptimal government operation. Now, what about the scenario where an able person has been recruited? Does this mean the person can contribute 100%? Not necessarily. The governing principles have outlined roughly 8 potential causes. Okay. One is that the ability is underutilized. Why? Well, this may be caused by inappropriate job matching, okay? Or perhaps the person is not given enough power and autonomy. For example, when Duke Huan of the state of Qi complained to Guan Zi, his chancellor, right? Why has he not produced expected governance outcome? Because obviously Guan Zi worked for the Duke, right? So Guan Zi said, well, I don't have appropriate authority to carry out my plan of economic reform. So as a result, the Duke granted him both financial resources and authority. And as a result, the country was subsequently well managed. We're omitting a lot of details here. Okay, so that's the first thing. 2 is that the service of an able person may be prematurely terminated. Prematurely terminated. Now let's think about the nature of social advancement and economic development. Okay, the social advancement and economic development take time. That is a fact, right? In order for a good plan to take a full effect, there is a need for policy consistency. Apparently, if the change in policy is necessary, then the government should do it with absolute resolution. But if we change policy from one to another every 4 or 5 years, then we may end up wasting a lot of time and energy. This is because it takes time for the society and the economy to adapt. Policies are designed and implemented by people. So changing the person in charge may end up changing the policy altogether. It doesn't always have to happen, but there is a chance of inconsistency of policy. Furthermore, during the policy implementation process, the person familiar with the policy may closely monitor the implementation process and make adjustment where appropriate. Therefore, if a person is prematurely terminated, then the policy may not be implemented at full potential. Right? If you think about a big company, a big public company, and if the CEO is changed every 2 years, right, with different strategies and management style, well, what do you think will happen to the company? So all in all, it's more beneficial to keep an able person in place for long enough to realize his full potential. That's the second problem. 3 is that the person's virtue may be overlooked by some minor resentment. 4 is that the person's contribution may be dismissed by small offense. And 5 is that this person's excellence may be concealed by minor flaw. So these 3 problems, right? Problem 3, 4, 5. These 3 problems are band together because they tell a very similar story. If an able person makes a mistake, which is something that we would expect from a human being anyway, the leader may get annoyed, possibly because of too high of an expectation. But more often, it is because the leader's judgment suffers from psychological bias. People tend to be influenced by short-term phenomenon and overlook the long-term picture, the big picture. This happens very often in the financial market, right? People may have spent months and months analyzing a public company and then make stock investment decision based on the conclusion, but then a small market turbulence may cause panic, which results in irrational sales. And later on, when the market is finally stabilized, the company's stock price comes back and continue to rise for an extended period of time. However, the investor has already sold the stocks and hasn't bought them back yet, which leads to a loss of opportunity of investment return, and to be frank, a complete waste of time. Meanwhile, an able person, following the previous discussion, an able person may be dismissed on the ground of public opinion. Now, the public opinion is important, as a mirror of government performance, right? However, public opinion can also be volatile and suffers from the same psychological bias that we mentioned just now. Because of the imperfect nature of human beings, if an able person's employment is entirely determined by public opinion, then there is a chance that a small mistake leads to great resentment, which overshadows the contribution and leads to consequent dismissal. Now, the last three cases are, for example, the person's integrity being hurt by the attack from malicious oppositions, or the leader's judgment is hindered by disinformation, and the person is dismissed by unfounded accusation, by jailers, backstabbers. These are all deliberate manipulation from the treacherous officials. And if the leader is unable to identify or to be watchful about these potentials, then the able person will not be utilized properly. So all of these 8 cases will lead to one thing, which is suboptimal human resource management and consequently suboptimal governance operation. And these are the absolute nightmare, man-made nightmares of the righteous ministers. And this is why they are vigilant about the leader's human resource management. This concludes Lecture 3. Thank you.